Constant struggle and how to snuggle up to the boss. Dropping panels with a stake in the existing path structure. Who only collect when the rest change your flick of the old profit and loss. Now you could say it's a whole different landscape. Class is the word plainly had on the lips of both and of you. Social movements collapse with the shift in the balance of forces. The agenda has been reset, you can bet we're in for a moon. It's not postmodernist, it's not post-feminist, it's not the end of history like they promised.
I don't suppose there'll be too many of you have been through the same era as I've been through. I was taken away from my mother when I was 6 months old. I was unfortunate, I was born out of wedlock, but today it's a recognised thing. But in my generation, it was a criminal. And they had us sent out to foster parents, and then after that I went into the Salvation Army home. We were going through a form of slavery with the Salvation Army. The boys, when they become 14, was put out onto farms, and girls were put out to do domestic work. When I went out to work on the farm, they gave you a corn bag to fill up with hay. That was your bed. Your blankets was corn bags sewn together, no sheets, no pillow slips. And I used to get up at 3:30 in the morning and go out in the frosty ground barefooted, rounding up cows. And then after that, we finished milking. We'd turn around and I'd do a day's work ploughing, and I worked from 3:30 in the morning till 9 or 10 o'clock at night. We could neither read nor write. We never met anybody. We never read books. We never saw magazines. We never heard of wireless. We were out on a prison farm. I was getting 6 shillings a week, and I haven't received a penny of that. I've gone to the State Department in Queensland to try and get my wages. They turned around and said that my files were destroyed in the 1970 floods in Brisbane. It flooded out the Treasury. Now this is how they can put it over. So in the last one, which is not so very long ago, I applied for them again. They said because I didn't come under the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders Act, I'm not entitled to my wages. And that's the sort of stuff that the government has been putting over, and they're still doing the same thing with the generations today. The younger generation today is going to go through exactly the same particular period as what we went through, because education is the number one thing in this society today, and the only ones that can get education and go to the university is the wealthy people's children. This is it. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
The violations of human and trade union rights at the hands of multinational enterprises, either directly or indirectly through their supply chains, in too many countries amounts to crimes against humanity. Despite this, the world's governments, our governments, are either complicit or at best attuned to turning a blind eye to the plight of their own citizens. Corporate greed is driving profit share at the expense of wages, safe workplaces, conditions and entitlements for workers. Not content with the raid on secure jobs and families' lives that they've already made in countries like Australia through casualisation, short-term contracts, labour hire and other forms of precarious employment. The corporate world in this country is now going after overtime, shift allowances, rostering arrangements and a myriad of other established conditions and entitlements, right up to and including the right, an internationally recognised right, to collective bargaining. And increasingly we witness the compliance of governments who stand willing to do the bidding of such corporate dictators. With the control of both houses of Parliament in their grasp, the Australian government, pushed and prodded by business, has blood in their sights, workers' blood. Every worker deserves an individual contract is their battle cry, or as we say, the individual contract and the right to say, sign here or you don't get the job. Collective bargaining is old economy, they argue, anti-productive and the antithesis of productivity, and should only happen where the boss agrees. Penalty rates for overtime and shift work, compensation for those family hostile hours, is so passé that the 38-hour week should now span Monday to Sunday. Why have a working week of Monday to Friday? As for holidays and paid sick leave, well, why not cash them out? And while we're at it, dismantle unfair dismissal protections for 99% of corporate workplaces in Australia. Union organising, well, let's restrict that, and let's set up the Orwellian-named Fair Pay Commission to drive down those rises in minimum wages. Our Prime Minister, John Howard, makes no excuses for whose side he's on. Trust business. Business knows best. Well, we say trust which business? James Hardie, Enron, Walmart, OneTel, HIH, Krispy Kremes, as we've seen in Penrith, or Baker's Delight, or any of the myriad other franchises actually telling our kids they don't need basic conditions. Well, you know what? Not on our watch. Corporate greed says, trust us. We want all of the rights. We want the right to tell workers they can sign the contract or they've got a choice, the choice not to take the job. Well, that's not what we want. At the heart of democracy is actually a commitment to collective responsibility, and that requires collective activism. I don't need to tell you that corporate greed's out of control. You can see it all around us. Not only is there a contentment about raiding the tax base necessary for services by demanding both lower taxes and more corporate subsidies, but CEOs' salaries are so obscene that they've reached a level that I would describe as moral depravity. Company management that pays less than $2 a day to the poorest of workers, while in their own countries campaign against a minimum wage on which a family can live with dignity, is not a world that we support. And while ever there is not a capacity to sit down and negotiate with the corporate world on the basis of rights, not of paternalism, but of rights, then we will fight for a world that is indeed a better one. Whatever it takes, for as long as it takes. We need to fight for the very heart of what makes for global law that is decent, and that is not only workplace rights, but more broadly human rights. Thank you.
Join us to say no to the fat hats of the Fourth Conference.
We are here in loud, peaceful protest to have our voice heard and to show our dissent to the warmongers and the racists, to give our solidarity to the oppressed people all across the world.
And on behalf of the Gadigal people, I welcome all of you.
The voice of dissent will be heard here today.
This country had the strongest union movement in the world. In the 1950s and 1960s, we had over 70% of all people were in unions. That's when we got the sort of benefits that we have now. We've got free universities, free medicine, benefits that these scum over in our Opera House are now trying to butcher, carve up and sell off.
They oppose laws that legislate for minimum hours of work. They oppose laws which legislate for holidays and vacation time.
We've got laws that have just been passed through the lower house of Parliament that allow a federal government agency to kidnap building workers, give them 14 days to dob in their mates and explain who was at union meetings, and if they don't do that, they'll be locked up for 6 months. These are the laws of a fascist state, and that fascist state is whining, swining and dining over in the Opera House, in our Opera House.
And we're going to tell John Howard and these corporate filth over there, we're not prepared to cop them. We're going to fight them to the end and build the movement that will see the end of their unsustainable, anti-people way of life.
We have to stop the profits flowing, and the best way to stop the profits flowing is militant industrial action.
We've got a starkly different vision to those people who are here in Sydney for the Forbes conference. They hold the view that there should be no subsidies provided in order to support the renewable energy industry. But we hold the view that if we are going to look after the future of this planet, that means investing in the capacity for us to have long-term, sustainable, renewable energy resources. And we know that that's the way of the future. And the views being expressed by Forbes are the way of the past.
Millions of people globally are recognising that climate change is the single biggest threat to humanity as we know it right now. Yet inside the Sydney Opera House this evening, we have organisations who are still funding climate change scepticism right around the world. The only reason there is no action on climate change is because of the oil companies in the Sydney Opera House tonight who are profiting from continued use of fossil fuels like oil and coal and gas.
Same old long you done, same old love, because in an option we say time.
There were some pretty crazy ideas in there at the Forbes Forum. They were describing the war on Iraq, and it was written up in one of the Forbes magazines as a fantastic opportunity for businesses to get their hands on, quote, juicy deals. Well, that's not how we see our comrades, our brothers and our sisters who are the people of Iraq. And when we join on the streets with our fellow peace activists from all around the world, we speak up for the rights of those people, not for juicy deals for businesses like those people who are here for Forbes.
If you actually analyse and if you actually read what the people around Forbes are saying, it is the essence of extremism. These people really are fanatics, and I think it's true to say that we're in a situation where there is, in fact, a massive gulf between what the elites and what the establishment are saying and doing and what the majority of people in society think and believe. I hear from the government in Australia exactly the same phrases that I heard literally 3 or 4 days ago in London. I mean, it's clearly coordinated between the media, the institutions of the state and so on and so forth in Britain, but it's a global thing going on. It really is an axis of evil. And for example, the kind of demonisation of Muslims and people of Arab origin in the media and in the, from the government and so forth is having an effect on society. There's been a 600% increase in in attacks on Muslims in Britain. At the same time, we shouldn't mistake attacks in the press for what is going on in kind of people's minds. And it's not the case in Britain that there is a massive wave of popular racism. I think the racists have been given a certain amount of confidence, but it's not dividing society, it's not creating a massive backlash. And I think that comes out to the fact, first of all, that they are operating from a position of weakness. I think actually, even George Bush, but certainly Tony Blair, and I suspect John Howard, in many ways they're on the back foot. The key task Tony Blair had after the bombings on 7/7 was to convince people that the bombings were not connected to Iraq. That was the job that he was faced with, and it was always going to be an uphill task. But despite the fact that that's what the papers are saying, that's what the politicians of all parties are saying, that's what Tony Blair is saying day in, day out, 85% of the population of Britain see there is a connection between the war on Iraq and the bombings. They see that as the main connection, and that's very, very important, because that means in the end of the day, people are seeing through the smokescreen. Even in the United States, things are turning round fairly rapidly. It's very, very interesting that Cindy Sheehan has become a popular hero. This woman who's the mother of a soldier who died in Iraq, she's become a popular hero. It's quite clear that she kind of expresses the opinions of probably the majority of people in the United States. There is actually panic at the moment, semi-concealed and sort of repressed panic going on in the Pentagon and the White House. Because at one and the same time, I think the elites in the US and ordinary people in the US have recognised that the war in Iraq cannot be won. And that's created massive turbulence. One day you hear a leak from Newsweek, for example, which says that people in the Pentagon are saying that defeating the resistance in Iraq is no longer a prerequisite for withdrawing. The next day you hear Donald Rumsfeld coming on TV saying the situation's so bad we're going to have to send 2 more divisions of troops in. And so, you know, they are caught in a situation where they don't have any solution, they don't have any way out, and that's very, very dangerous for them. They're kind of caught between growing resistance in Iraq, growing chaos in Iraq, and a massively growing movement in the United States. And of course, you know, unfortunately, most sections of social democracy, most Labour parties have kind of sold their soul to the market, and so that means that it could appear if you came from Mars that there's no opposition to these values, that everyone buys into these values, that, you know, the market is the only way forward, there is no alternative, this is the only way to organise society, it's all about profits and efficiency. You could believe there's nothing else out there, but then actually when you listen to people, you find time after time that people are developing a critique, and that when you turn round and you act with audacity and courage, and you stand up very publicly and say no, and actually speak truth unto power, and put an alternative, and say that there are other ways, there is such a thing as justice, there is such a thing as fairness, and that this war is wrong and it's based on lies and it's a criminal war, when you say that you get a massive response. We shouldn't be pessimistic in the current situation. It feels as if they're on the attack, and they are on the attack, but we firmly believe in Britain that if we put together the kind of coalition with the Muslims, with the trade unions, with the peace movement, we'll turn the tables on them, and we will create a situation where people feel, instead of there being no alternative, where people feel there really is hope in society. I think it's a very exciting time as well as a very frightening time, but we need to lead from the front. Thank you very much.
What we're seeing from this war on terror is, I guess, in some ways a neocon's wet dream. From the moment that the occupation, the invasion took place, we saw even simple things like the abolition of taxes in Iraq for a whole year. We've now seen the imposition of a 15% flat tax rate. We're also seeing the privatisation of vital infrastructure. Long after the tanks are gone, what will be left will be the privatisation of services and the corporatisation from foreign multinationals in that country. So we're going to see the offices of Halliburton and Bechtel and General Electric. Those will be the things that will remain. We need to see it as part of a broader neoliberal agenda. The war was supposedly about fostering democracy, but the furphy that you can have a democratic movement under occupation, under economic and military occupation at that, is a complete farce, and it's a joke, and that's what we're seeing happening at the moment in Iraq. We've had a puppet government installed, we've had elections that were completely farcical, and now we have a constitution that is not really going to come to fruition. This is not a project about democracy at all. In fact, fact, the very purpose of going to war and the way in which it was done was inherently undemocratic. Here in Australia, it was done expressly against the wishes of the population. We hear that the war was about liberation, it was about, preventing the spread of so-called Islamic fundamentalism, when in fact the US is now in Iraq responsible for funding and backing militarily and economically some of the most fundamentalist aspects of Iraqi society. And they're doing that because they really need an in order to prevent that resistance from taking hold and from throwing them out. The war is costing the United States $1 billion a week. In Australia, we spend $55 million a week on our military. In Iraq, we're seeing cities razed to the ground so that they can just be reconstructed again by private corporations, foreign multinationals. We're seeing super profits being generated by corporations like Bechtel that are relying on the public purse and these so-called reconstruction dollars that are being provided for Iraq, but are in fact going straight into the pockets of Halliburton executives. The military-industrial complex is a key pillar that's propping up global capitalism, and we're seeing that most acutely in what's happening in Iraq and Afghanistan and in Palestine. And the other reason that we need to oppose this neoliberal agenda and what it means in terms of this so-called war on terror and the war in Iraq is that it's been used as an excuse to ratchet up police powers. It's been used as an excuse to ratchet up those powers because of some kind of supposed external threat that we have. So it encourages us, in a quite insidious way, I think, to look around us and to point at each other and to create those divisions in society when really we should be looking up and we should be blaming those above us for the kinds of economic and social problems that we're facing. These powers that have been given to, the boys and girls in blue, supposedly to protect us, are in fact the only times that we really see them exercised in a clear way is against activists and in terms of cracking down on social dissent.
For workers' rights, human rights and the environment, the Howard government's agenda has been nothing short of disastrous. The Howard government, along with big business interests, is determined to take away our fundamental rights to leave our children and our grandchildren a healthy planet. John Howard's government's policies, just like George Bush's, are designed to pander to large corporations who want to cut corners around workers' rights and environmental protection to increase their profit margins which are already astronomical. I want to focus on climate change tonight to illustrate this point. Just 122 corporations account for 80% of all carbon dioxide emissions. And just 5 private global oil companies, ExxonMobil, BP Amoco, Shell, Chevron and Texaco, produce oil that contributes around 10% of the world's carbon emissions. What's the only thing that's benefiting from not acting on climate change, from not ratifying Kyoto and not supporting renewable energy forms like wind, solar and hydro? Big business, of course, and more specifically the fossil fuel industries. And what's behind the federal government's proposed industrial relations reforms? Of course, we know it's the result of pressure from big business. Big business want cuts, workers' rights to cut so that their profit margins increase. In March last year, Hugh Morgan, President of the Business Council of Australia, said, "The corporation is freedom at work in the economic life of the nation. When all is said and done, the attack on the corporation is an attack on freedom. Today, the corporation, along with other business entities, is in danger of being regulated to death." Really? The corporations represented by their CEOs at the 5th Annual Forbes Conference in Sydney this week are hardly close to death. But their quest for higher and higher profits means they have been working overtime to weaken laws that protect our rights. And just as the unions are facing a concerted attack backed by corporate Australia, so too are environment groups. At a national level, the right-wing think tank, the Institute of Public Affairs, or the IPA, has NGOs firmly in its sights, NGOs, non-government organisations. It believes that NGOs have too much influence and has been undertaking a concerted campaign to undermine us. Just as John Howard gets all his cues from George Bush, so too does the IPA get theirs from think tanks established in the US to defund the left. That's what they're calling it, defunding the left, like the Heritage Foundation and the Competitive Enterprise Institute. In 1995, the environmental watchdog CLEAR obtained documentation that details evidence of a right-wing legislative effort to defund the left, being coordinated by an alliance of conservative advocacy groups and members of Congress. Their target, federal funding of non-profit advocacy organisations. It's critical that we all support NGOs and unions as much as we can during this time when some of them are fighting for their very survival, and it's critical that NGOs and unions support each other. We need to mobilise so that we have influence. Governments will continue to sit there and say their hands are tied behind their backs until the pressure is so great that they are forced to act. Where's the mass demonstrations around climate change? Where are the sit-ins? Where's the civil disobedience, the creative non-violent direct action? Dare I say it, where are the arrests? The suffragette movement didn't get women the vote by producing a few reports and talking quietly with decision makers. Nor did the civil rights movement break down what seemed at the time like impenetrable barriers around race by holding a few summits and press conferences. What started off as a few courageous women and men braving ridicule and retribution to fight for their rights resulted in millions worldwide rallying to their cause, and they won. So I put a call out to all of you tonight. This country needs to build a movement on climate change, a movement against the greed of the wealthy corporations and the individuals behind them who are prepared to gamble all of our futures away to make their next billion. As Australians, we owe it to the world to build a mass movement on climate change because we are the highest emitters of greenhouse gases in the world per person. To build this movement, we need the commitment and passion of each and every activist, organiser and concerned individual in this room tonight, and together we need to take some risks.
Hey Kate, I hear you're a little upset lately.
Yeah, B, there's been a guy annoying me. I'll tell you about it.
Now our own Prime Minister has said that no Muslim in this country has the right to seriously disagree with the government's policies. Indeed, shame. Now, Education Minister Brendan Nelson has bluntly told Muslims who do not accept what he defines as Australian values should literally clear off. Everyone in this country asks one simple question: where will this end?
This so-called war on terror is not about protecting us. The ramping up of police powers that we've seen have only been used against activists. They've been used against activists at the WTO demos, and they're being used today against activists here. Activists have been prevented from coming to the demonstrations through active police intimidation. Banners have been prevented from being put up. We've been prevented from walking down in what is public space while the cops are protecting those people in the inside. They're protecting them because they need protecting. And they need protecting because those of us here represent thousands and millions of people around the world who are standing up against their war profiteering and against the way that they seek to organise society.
So 9/11's been and gone, but it was 11/9 where I'm from. Did the USA even stop and think? Nah, rather get on the brink of a new world war, cause peace is worth fighting for.
The campaign at the moment is focused on so-called Muslim terror, but it's directed at all of us, Muslims and non-Muslims alike. The governments, the media outlets and the others who are stoking literally the furnaces of hate have their own agenda in demonising Muslims. If they all divide us between each other and against each other, then they can get away with their domestic agenda. They can ram through the attacks on students, the attacks on workers, the so-called reforms to IR, the attacks on single mothers. They can ram through attacks on anybody. And they are doing it. And then, of course, there's the international agenda. More and more and more imperialist wars.
One woman, Cindy Sheehan, who just wanted some answers as to why her son died, has managed to strike a chord in the heart of millions of Americans across that country. And George Bush is not going to get away with this now because she's not going to give up and the people at Camp Casey are not going to give up. George Bush leaves his vacation ranch tomorrow And the people from Camp Casey have already hired about 10 or a dozen large buses, and they're going to follow him to Washington DC. Meanwhile, back at Camp Casey, a bunch of war veterans have decided that they ain't leaving either, and they're going to stay in Crawford, Texas until the end of the war in Iraq.
In Iraq and Afghanistan, where our soldiers in our name have killed literally hundreds of thousands of people. These are not issues just for Muslims, these are issues for all of us.
Ain't it just a little bit funny how they started a war over oil and money? Oh yeah.
And one of the most powerful images at Camp Casey is this row of small wooden white crosses. Each one has the name of an American soldier, man or woman, who was killed in Iraq. Now, that line of crosses goes so far down that road leading up to Bush's ranch that at the beginning of it, you can't see the end of it. That's an amazingly powerful image. And I just stood there and when I looked at that, I imagined the grief of 1,800 mothers, in addition to Cindy. And what I also couldn't help thinking was that there is no road long enough to plant the crosses to mark the 100,000 Iraqi deaths. And the suffering that this war has caused is truly universal.
The war in Iraq is costing the US government, as of September 2006, it will have cost them $206 billion. In Australia, we are spending $55 million a week on our military. And we're buying tanks and weapons specifically to go overseas and join the US in their military adventures. 500,000 Iraqi children have died in the lead up to this war in Iraq. And 100,000 Iraqis have paid with their lives once again. While companies like Bechtel and Halliburton and Boeing and BMW, people who are today, their CEOs are sitting in that opera house over there, their hands are washed with the blood of those people in the Middle East, in Iraq, in Afghanistan and in Palestine. And it is this sort of military-industrial complex that is propping up the war on terror and the war in Iraq.
If working people as a whole are united, we can stop this. But if we allow them to divide us, they can kick us off, one by one.
Capitalism, kick it over.
And when we say another world is possible, we don't just say it's possible, we say we're going to make it happen.
Kick it over. Kick it over.
I come from a union which has bargained hard about wages and employment conditions for many decades, but also a union that has got a long history, involvement in broader social and political issues for decades. We've made representation and protested against human rights violations around the world and attacks upon trade union rights from authoritarian governments in dictatorships from Africa to Latin America to Asia. But we're now confronted with the same type of repressive laws that we protested against for decades around the world. And I want to briefly outline some of the legislation that's confronting the CFMEU. Many of you here would be conversant with the broad attacks upon workers' wages and trade union rights in this country. The attack upon the minimum wage, restrictions on right of entry, attacks upon award rights, but many of you would be less aware of the unprecedented attack upon trade union rights in the building industry. Unprecedented, not just in this country, but amongst some of the worst and most repressive labour laws in the world. The misnamed Building and Construction Industry Improvement Bill. And in that legislation, they've not just banned strikes, they've resolved that all forms of union meetings on building sites are now unlawful, except if there's an imminent threat to your life, not if you're concerned about workplace safety. It's an imminent threat to your life, and the workers and the union are required to prove it, not to a court of law, but to a special tribunal they've established with hand-selected ideologues determined to crush union activity in the building industry. And they've backed it up with massive fines, not just against the union, but also against individual workers. The fines that are retrospective are $110,000 against the union for every occasion where one worker stops work against a company in the building industry. If we go to one site to have a meeting about workplace safety that involves 10 workers, one from each company, we're confronted with fines of $1.1 million for a meeting about workplace safety. And the workers themselves are confronted with fines of $22,000 a head. 100 workers participating in a meeting represents a potential fine of $2.2 million against a handful of workers on one workplace taking up issues such as workplace safety or a workplace grievance. Massive fines, and if that wasn't enough, the opportunity for uncapped compensation for the developer and the builder caused by any form of union activity, any strike, any meeting that impacts on the profits of the developers can be landed against the union. And once again, not decided by a court of law, but by this special tribunal they've established to attack the building unions. A tribunal with 150 officers, with a budget of $96 million, working full-time to crush union activity in the building industry. And just like suspected terrorists, they've suspended the right to silence for union delegates, for workers on building sites. And to back it up, you're required to participate in interrogation sessions. And if you don't want to participate, if you don't want to answer a question as to what union you're a member of, who's your union delegate, which delegate gave out what leaflet on a building site or made what recommendation about union activity, you face the prospect of 6 months in jail. Some of us might have read about the McCarthy era in the United States in the 1950s, when people were asked the question, have you been? Are you a member of the Communist Party? Are you sympathetic to communism or communist ideals? Now workers are being asked about their union activities, their role of their delegates and their role of the union officials. We're now confronting some of the worst labour laws in the world. Very significant attacks upon civil liberties, human rights and democratic rights. And their special tribunal has got no jurisdiction to look at issues that concern workers, about issues of underpayment of wages, of exploitation of migrant workers, of workplace safety. They're confined to looking at inappropriate trade union activity. And I come from an industry where one worker is killed every week on a building site. Despite the challenge and despite the difficulties, I'm very confident of the capacity of our movement to defeat these attacks. You've seen some mass activities on July 1. The next mass activity will be the largest trade union gathering any person in this room has ever witnessed on November 15, when hundreds of thousands of workers in every capital city and major town across this country stop work on the same day, some for 24 hours, some for 2 hours, which will build up to defeat this legislation. The outcome isn't guaranteed, but with a lot of hard work, courage and passion, I'm confident of the outcome.
To resist, the age of the fist means now we'll have to deal with a massive increase in violence from police. It's not surprising a student uprising's met with a dawn raid. 5 activists on the hit list. Liberals shrink, they think they can hoodwink the critical mass pig's arse. All out assault, pressure on the fault line, moves the critical mass. Pressure on the fault line, moves the critical mass. It's not postmodernist, it's not post-feminist, it's not the end of history like they promised. It's not post-structuralist or post-industrialist, it's a new age of the fist. Post-this, it's a new age of the fist. Post-this.
One practical proposal, this big workers' mobilisation that's happening in November, why can't we around the nation have the trade union leaders agree that simultaneously we spend 1 minute in silence for all of the people that have been killed in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq?
You've got my vote, but we've got a lot of unions right across this country. Sharon's in a more influential position than myself. But,
there seem to be 2 strategies in the union movement. One which is a strategy of actually getting out and fighting. On the other hand, you see this thing of, oh, we can't actually beat the legislation now, and so what we have to do is we have to run this long campaign to get Labor elected. And quite frankly, I think after hearing Kim Beazley announcing that they're not going to remove AWAs, there's absolutely no guarantee. Even if we wait 2.5 years, I think 2.5 years is a long time, and a lot of people will be signing AWAs in the meantime if we don't defeat this legislation now.
I and Greg Combay actually led the ideas about a week of action around the executive table with other union leaders. There are, in fact, rallies, protests, community forums going on every day of the week. So there's no defeat from us, but what we do know is a bit of a reality here, that in fact there are 2 houses of parliament, and guess who has the numbers?
what I've seen in recent months was May 27 in New South Wales, the largest meeting of delegates from workplaces I've ever seen in my working life. Absolutely. July 1, 120,000 workers from every industry participating on July 1st. November 15 will be the largest union rally you've seen in your lifetime. I want to say to you, this isn't a battle for the next few months. It's a battle over many years to build a stronger and more effective union movement. I'm not campaigning to kick out the Liberals, to put Labor in. I'm campaigning for a stronger union movement to force politicians to carry out a working class agenda.
None of us have ever been part of a society that's relied on politicians to do the job for us. If you go back to the Vietnam War or the dams dispute, it was people's voices and a collective sense of community support that actually gave any politician the courage to do something about it.
Everyone needs to work on building the unions, but we also really we have to understand that the unions have to work with a range of other movements in order to develop a viable vision and alternative that is much longer, even longer term than protecting the rights that we're currently fighting for at the moment. If you want to oppose global capitalism, you have to join together with the anti-war movement and the union movement and the environmental movement, because we are all fundamentally part of the same struggle.
At the very bottom of this, we've got a system which is based upon the exploitation of human being by human being. And we need to, I'm put a question to ask everyone here. If a better world is possible, what does it look like?
Right now, John Howard is saying, I can smash up the union movement by dividing them. So we've had a whole series of attacks on the Muslim community in particular. Right now, young women in schools in Australia are being told they shouldn't wear the hijab. And I think this meeting should actually come out strongly and say, we are united, we are not going to let them divide us. We support the Muslim women.
For feminists of my generation, we stood up and said we had a right to wear what we chose. We were obviously talking in large part about sexual oppression, but nevertheless, to be free of harassment on the basis of wearing what we chose. We should be supporting Muslim women to wear what they choose to wear.
If the current round of attacks on the Muslim community succeed and go unanswered, it will be a setback for those people for years or even decades. And I think at the same time, the attack on the Muslim community is an attack on the movement as well.
The trade union movement has been going for a long time, long before Howard was born, and the trade union movement will be here when he's gone. We'll be here when John Howard's gone.
There USA, which side are you on? Israel or Palestine, which side are you on? Bougainville or CRA, which side are you on? To fight for a superpower, even at the hands of a dictator, means breathing space for the rest of the human race. It brings the hour of revolution closer. 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 It's not postmodernist, it's not post-feminist, it's not the end of history like they promised. It's not post-structuralist or post-industrialist, it's a new age of the fist. Post this, it's a new age of the fist. Post this, it's a new age of the fist. Post this, it's a new age of the fist. Post this.